Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing what the San Jose Sharks 23-man roster could begin to look like as we move forward over these next few weeks. And the reason I'm making this video now is in direct response to the news that we learned yesterday that the Sharks sent down both Bordeleau and Shakir Mukhamadullin to the San Jose Barracuda. Neither of these players had actually played any regular season games for the Sharks this year. In fact, they really didn't participate in preseason or training camp either, both due to these longer-term injuries. Now, however, as they get closer and closer to return, since they are waiver exempt, it makes a lot of sense to let them get some time down there with the Barracuda, get a bit more up to speed before making their return to the NHL lineup and seeing who they may end up replacing. The Barracuda play a game tonight against the Henderson Silver Knights. They will then have another game in a couple of days against the Silver Knights again. And I imagine both of these players, or at least one of them, will be in those lineups for the Barracuda. At that point, and especially once this current San Jose Sharks road trip does come to an end, the Sharks will be faced perhaps with their first roster tough decision of the year. If we go back to the beginning of the season when the Sharks were originally narrowing things down to 23 guys, the Sharks kind of avoided having to make a tough call by running the rarely seen 15-forward unit for their 23-man roster, which allowed them to keep Kostin and Grundstrom and Gushin and Javanni Smith all up here. However, now, with these players' imminent returns, these players coming off of the injured reserve or the injured non-roster or whatever you want to call it, somebody is going to have to get the axe here. Somebody is going to have to get sent down, and Greer is going to have to make a tough decision. Well, at least one tough decision. The other decision is actually relatively straightforward because the very obvious answer to the question of who gets sent down, at least in favor of one of these players, let's say Bordeleau, should be Javanni Smith. He performed admirably during the San Jose Sharks preseason, but honestly not that fantastic. He ended up making it to the 23-man roster simply so that the Sharks could avoid having to make a tough call. But since then, the Sharks have played 7 regular season games. He's only been in the lineup a single time, and only because the Sharks were rather shorthanded for that game. That was the game against Winnipeg that Celebrini and Eklund and Will Smith were all out for. And then the one thing that Javanni Smith actually brings to the lineup is his physicality. That's literally the one aspect of his game that he has over anybody else there in the Sharks' bottom 6, and that wasn't even on display in that Jets game. Frankly, he was just completely invisible, and like I said, that was the only game he actually ended up playing, so there's very little reason to have him stick around here. That is a clear choice for Mike Greer to be the first casualty of these two players returning to the lineup. Now, Javanni Smith will have to pass through waivers, so there is a very small chance that he does get picked up, but as I say, very, very small. Javanni Smith doesn't actually hold that much value as a player who isn't even able to make the Sharks forward group on a consistent basis day after day for the second straight season is probably not valued all that heavily by teams elsewhere from San Jose. So this is not even a player who I think the Sharks could get even a 7th round pick straight up in a trade, so whether they lose him or not, it honestly doesn't really matter in the end. The real tough question is who ends up getting sent down with Javanni Smith, because let's say it is a forward-for-forward swap. The Sharks want to call up Bordeleau, and so they send down Javanni Smith. But then when they want to call up Shakir Mukhamadullin, who is a defenseman, the defenseman who he might end up replacing in the roster is a bit of a tough call. Now, had you asked me a few days ago, let's say back on Saturday, for instance, I would have said the obvious answer here is Jack Thompson, a player who is waiver exempt, who had yet to have played an NHL game for the Sharks. He was called up, and yet he didn't manage to draw into the lineup for those first couple of games. Seemed like that would be a pretty done and dusted deal. But now we have seen Thompson play pretty solid hockey against a tough Colorado Avalanche team, and then incredibly good hockey, best defenseman on the Sharks, just yesterday against the Anaheim Ducks, where at this point it is very difficult to justify taking him out of the lineup. In fact, it would be doing an incredible disservice to Jack Thompson as a player and as a prospect, defensive prospect for the San Jose Sharks, something where they definitely could use an advantage in. It would be doing an incredible disservice to him to take him out of the lineup in favor of someone like Matt Benning simply because he is waiver exempt, which then leads us to the next choice, which is indeed Matt Benning. He is the player who sat out in the previous couple of games. He's been replaced by Thompson. He has been outperformed by Thompson as well. But the major problem here, like with Smith, is that Benning would have to pass through waivers. And unlike with Javanni Smith, who is extremely unlikely, we're talking about like single-digit percentage points of him being picked up, Matt Benning definitely has a bit of a better chance. For one, Matt Benning as a right-shot defenseman is somewhat valuable. He's also a veteran guy who has been a consistent NHL player, not a great one, but a consistent NHL player at least prior to these last couple of seasons. His first year of his contract with the San Jose Sharks, he actually performed quite admirably, even if at the beginning of this season he's been completely awful. And he's also on an incredibly affordable contract this year and next, still under deal, but he's making very, very little amount of money, relatively close to league minimum. And so while there might not be some big playoff teams who are really looking to pick up Benning, others who are on the outside looking in who could use a little bit of defensive help, picking up Matt Benning as just a potential seventh defenseman of their own, that actually might be something that they're looking forward to. And so for Mike Grier, it wouldn't really be the end of the world to lose Matt Benning for free off of waivers, and this should not really be used as a justification to send down Jack Thompson, because at the end of the day, not only does Thompson actually give you a better chance of winning hockey games than Matt Benning, but he's also a better choice for the future, so that's like a double win, a double whammy there. For Benning, though, I can understand the kind of hesitation from Mike Grier to want to send him down. So I imagine at this point, Mike Grier is trying to work the phones at least a bit to see if he can move on from one of these defensemen that currently sit here in the lineup, whether that be Benning or whether that be Ruda or whether that even be Mario Ferraro or Cody Ceci. Someone needs to perhaps make some room here in the near future, unless the Sharks want to start waiving these players and lose them for free. I don't think that would be a terrible choice for San Jose. I do still think that might be the correct move forward, but for Grier, I don't know if he wants to lose these players for free like that, considering how hesitant he was back at the beginning of the season to even waive Javanni Smith. Now, the other option when it comes to Mukhamadullin is that you don't actually have to replace a defenseman for him. The Sharks could go to running 8 defensemen in their 23-man roster instead of 7, which means they would have to demote another forward. We've already talked about Smith as the obvious answer, but then we have to discuss a second one. That would likely come down to either Grundstrom, who we know also missed last game against the Ducks, Klim Kostin, Danil Gushchin, unfortunately, is also in that conversation as well. Now, I also do know that there have been many people discussing the possibility of Will Smith heading down to the AHL. I, in multiple comments, have talked about how I think that would actually do him some good and help him get some confidence back and everything like that. However, Mike Grier addressed the media a couple of days ago, and in discussing Will Smith's development plan of how he's going to sit out a few games here or there during the first half of the season, he also mentioned that he does not foresee, he is not planning for Will Smith to ever end up with the San Jose Barracuda this year. Now, he didn't fully rule it out, but at the same time, a GM is not usually going to come out and say, yeah, it's never going to happen, because then he'll look a bit weird if he is forced to walk that back in a couple of months' time. But Grier was pretty much as sure as one can actually be without saying it fully outright that Smith will remain with the San Jose Sharks for the rest of this year. So we have to discount that as a possibility. He will likely remain in the Sharks lineup until April, until the end of the season, and hopefully things will just improve naturally like that. So we go back to the actual conversation of who are the potential forwards that drop for Mukhamadullin if the Sharks decide to go that way. Grundstrom, Kostin, Gushchin might, kind of like with Jack Thompson, seem like the easiest possible choice simply because he is waiver exempt, but also like with Thompson, Gushchin, it would be doing him a great disservice to actually send him down. Besides the Avalanche game, where I don't think Gushchin was all that great, he was one of the Sharks' best forwards just the other night against the Anaheim Ducks yesterday. He was their best forward against the Winnipeg Jets, and he was also pretty solid in his first game of the season against the St. Louis Blues. He has been quite good. He has come very close to scoring just yesterday, we of course know, but also just many strong offensive zone chances. He's playing now on the second line, and also on top of all of that, the Sharks desperately need the offense. This is why bringing up Bordeleau and Shakir Mukhamadullin in the first place is a smart move. You need some offense in this group. They've been shut out at even strength for each of these past couple of games against an Avalanche team that has just been bleeding goals this year and an Anaheim Ducks team that really isn't all that great. So the fact that they're not even managing to score there is not a good thing. So keeping Gushchin around, not only because he's been playing well, but also he gives the best offensive chance for your team compared to the other two players, it makes sense. So that gets narrowed down to either Grundstrom or Kostin. Now, you could kind of make arguments in either direction, I would say. For instance, if you really want the best offensive player here, that would have to be Klim Kostin. When he's playing well, he is definitely miles better than whatever Grundstrom could actually do offensively. However, on the other hand, Kostin is also an incredibly unpredictable and unreliable player, very inconsistent. Just yesterday, he started the game off very, very strong for the first 30 minutes. His first couple of shifts, really effective. Then his last couple of shifts were quite awful, and by the end of the game, he only ended up with 6.5 minutes of ice time, which is exceptionally low and shows the perhaps lack of trust that Warsofsky actually has in him as a player. So if the Sharks instead want to go down the safe path, it might be better for them to actually hang on to Carl Grundstrom and then decide to instead send down Kostin. Now, like with Smith, like with Benning, Kostin would end up having to pass through waivers. I think his odds of getting picked up are somewhere between Benning and Smith. I do think there is a decent chance that a team, especially one that's outside of the playoffs, might look to pick him up and see if they can get a decent offensive forward like a third liner out of him. So again, it might be a situation where Mike Grier is hesitant to make a call, but as was the case with Thompson, the fact is that while Gushchin is that waiver-exempt guy, he is giving you the best chance to win, and he is a smart move for the future. So it yet is another win-win, double whammy type of situation. So to me, when it comes to Bordeleau and Mukhamadullin, the two obvious candidates really to send down here would be Javanni Smith, and then I'm kind of leaning towards Klim Kostin as well. Leave Benning around because I think he might have a little bit more trade value. Send down the couple forwards and then just run an 8 defensive unit. Benning can continue to just sit on the sidelines. Mukhamadullin might be able to step in favor of someone like Jan Ruda. Certainly wouldn't be the end of the world there. And then run something like that. But the conversation doesn't just stop there, because while Bordeleau and Mukhamadullin's return to the NHL is a lot more imminent, there are a couple of other players who are injured but could be returned to the lineup at some point over these next few weeks. That is Macklin Celebrini, of course, but then also perhaps the forgotten Marc-Edouard Vlasic. That's not something that will happen within the week or two, probably more so 3 to 4 weeks, but when both of those players are looking to make the return, the Sharks will have to make yet another tough call. For instance, with Celebrini, I would imagine the player who then gets sent down would have to be Carl Grundstrom. Again, if we're living in a world where the Sharks had originally sent down Smith and Kostin, Grundstrom seems like the very obvious choice for Celebrini. However, with the return of Marc-Edouard Vlasic, the Sharks simply cannot run a 9 defensive roster. So someone at that point will have to get sent down. The obvious candidate continues to be Matt Benning. Maybe at that point, if you are unable to actually trade him, you just decide, yeah, we'll put him on waivers. I wouldn't hate that. However, with that being said, Matt Benning does have the advantage of being a right-handed defenseman, which the Sharks would only have Ceci, Ruda, and Thompson for. So they might want to actually hang on to Matt Benning simply because he brings that in case someone gets injured. So at that point, your other choices are perhaps Mukhamadullin and Thompson, both being waiver-exempt players. If they're not performing very well over these next few weeks, they could end up making that call. But we also have to consider the possibility that Vlasic returns to the lineup and then himself just ends up going on waivers. Vlasic has not been all that great. In fact, he's been quite bad over these last few seasons for the Sharks. Last year, he did have a moment around let's say a month stretch where he was actually playing quite well for the Sharks, but outside of that, he was still very, very bad. He makes a ton of money, so it's completely well known that nobody would be taking him off of waivers. That is a literal 0% chance of actually happening. And so that could be the move that the Sharks make moving forward when he does return from injury. The only real argument against that is the sort of, I guess, disrespect that would be showing to this player who has played with the San Jose Sharks throughout his entire career with the organization. In fact, the general manager, Mike Grier, who would be sending him down, literally himself played with Marc-Edouard Vlasic for a few years when he was with the Sharks himself. So that might not be a move that Mike Grier is actually willing to make. Even just leaving Vlasic hanging around here as a healthy scratch would be, I guess, viewed as slightly less disrespectful than actually putting him onto waivers, which would of course make news around the league, not just amongst the San Jose Sharks fans. And so that might not be a move that Greer ends up going for, but if we're simply trying to find the best possible lineup and the one that makes the most sense, it feels as though Vlasic is kind of the odd man out. Again, it does depend on how Mukhamadullin and Thompson actually do over these next few weeks. If Thompson begins to slow down, or if Mukhamadullin looks a little bit out of place, one of them could end up heading back to the San Jose Barracuda, and that would be a slightly easier choice. But right now, it does seem that over these next few weeks, the San Jose Sharks are going to have to make pretty big use of the waiver wire, and they might end up losing a player or two because of it. But that will do it for this video. You know, as much as it might seem like a little bit of bad news that the Sharks will have to lose these players essentially for free here, you have to look on the bright side that the Sharks are going to be improving their roster with these more talented individuals coming back into the lineup. Bordeleau, Mukhamadullin, and then eventually Celebrini as well. And so while the Sharks are losing game after game after game currently, help is certainly on the way. Class dismissed.